government want to silence the people in this country who have had enough of mass uncontrolled immigration. Europe want mass immigration. The West want it, Canada, Australia. And people are starting to speak out. And when they saw those votes coming in for the Reform Party, they got scared. They got worried. And now they're doing everything to silence us. No, they'll just immediately arrest people and sentence them at some point because they don't like what's happening. People are getting fed up with this mass uncontrolled immigration.
CRIMINALIZE. Hello, sorry to bother you. Ben from GB News.
Yeah.
Been trying to get hold of you for a few days. Just
I'm
wanted
not
to fancy a quick
interested.
chat.
If I was, I would have returned your call.
How much money have you made from fixing Home Office applications for illegal migrants? Can you tell us? You said, have no fear, CRIMINALIZE is here. I'll help anyone who is illegal without a valid visa or anyone who's overstayed their visa using human rights loopholes. You charge £1,500 for business sponsor licences. Is that what's paid for your nice Mercedes with a private number plate? Is this Labour policy to do what you're doing? Have you got anything to say? Do you want the boats to stop?
What we're saying is send them back. Okay? Simple as that. Poland is the only country in European Union which we haven't had even one terrorist attack. We don't have stabbings, we don't have rapes, we don't have all these really dangerous behaviors from migrants, illegal migrants. So our policy is very straight, zero tolerance. We built a beautiful wall on our border with Belarus, and there's no way anyone would enter Poland. When you see the data from Eurostat, not ours, from European Union, Poland is the safest country in Europe.
The British government is preparing to unleash something that should terrify every citizen who values freedom. Right now, as you watch this, Labour politicians are finalising plans that could criminalise your opinions about immigration. We're not talking about hate speech. We're not talking about violence. We're talking about ordinary British people facing prosecution for simply questioning government policy. This isn't happening in some distant authoritarian state. This is happening in Britain in 2025, and the mechanisms of control are already being put in place. Goss, what's coming next will change everything you thought you knew about living in a free country. The clock is ticking, and most people have no idea what's about to hit them. The warning signs have been building for months, but most Britons haven't been paying attention. While families struggle with the cost of living and communities grapple with overcrowded public services, the Labour government has been quietly constructing a framework that could silence dissent on one of the most controversial topics in modern British politics. Immigration policy has always been a flashpoint, a subject that divides dinner tables and dominates election campaigns. But what's emerging now goes far beyond political disagreement. This is about power, control, and the fundamental question of whether British citizens will retain the right to criticise their own government. The machinery being assembled doesn't just target extremists or genuine threats. It's designed with a much broader scope, one that could ensnare journalists, journalists, activists, and everyday people who dare to question the direction their country is heading. The chilling reality is that legislation currently moving through Parliament contains provisions so vaguely worded that almost any criticism of immigration policy could potentially fall within its scope. Think about what this actually means for a moment. Britain has always prided itself on being the birthplace of parliamentary democracy, a nation where free speech and robust debate are considered cornerstones of civic life. The Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, centuries of legal tradition protecting individual liberties against government overreach. All of this heritage is now at risk. The proposals being discussed in Westminster aren't framed as attacks on freedom, of course. They never are. Instead, they come wrapped in the language of safety, cohesion and protection. The government insists these measures are necessary to combat hate speech and prevent social division. But scratch beneath the surface and a very different picture emerges. Legal experts who've examined the draft legislation are raising urgent alarms about how these powers could be applied in practice. The definitions of harmful speech are so elastic, so open to interpretation, that they could be stretched to cover almost any uncomfortable truth about immigration statistics, integration challenges, or the strain on public resources. What makes this particularly sinister is the way it's being rolled out. There's no dramatic announcement, no honest debate about the trade-offs between security and liberty. Instead, the changes are being buried in technical amendments, rushed through committee stages and presented as minor adjustments to existing hate speech laws. The mainstream media, already treading carefully around immigration topics for fear of being labelled prejudiced, has largely failed to sound the alarm. Most coverage focuses on surface-level political drama while ignoring the profound implications of what's actually being proposed. By the time most Britons realise what's happened, the legal framework will already be in place, the enforcement mechanisms will already be operational, and the precedents will already be set. This is how democracies don't die with a bang, but with a whisper, as rights are gradually eroded in the name of noble-sounding objectives. The timing of this crackdown is no coincidence. Immigration to Britain has reached levels that even many pro-immigration advocates acknowledge are unprecedented. Public services are stretched beyond capacity. Housing shortages have reached crisis proportions. Cultural tensions are visible in communities across the country. Rather than addressing these legitimate concerns through honest policy discussion, the government's response appears to be shutting down the conversation itself. If people can't talk about the problems they're experiencing, if raising concerns means risking criminal prosecution, then the government never has to answer difficult questions or justify its decisions. It's the ultimate political strategy. Silence your critics by making criticism itself illegal. The blueprint for this approach already exists in other European nations where similar laws have been implemented, and the results should terrify anyone who cares about democratic accountability. Look at what's happened in countries that went down this path before Britain. In Germany, citizens have faced police investigations for social media posts questioning migration policy. In Sweden, journalists have been prosecuted for reporting immigration crime statistics. In France, political candidates have been hauled before courts for campaign speeches that were deemed too critical of immigration. These aren't isolated incidents or misapplications of well-intentioned laws. This is the system working exactly as designed, creating a climate of fear where people self-censor rather than risk becoming targets. The psychological impact of such laws extends far beyond the individuals actually prosecuted. When people see others being investigated, charged, or convicted for expressing opinions, the message spreads rapidly through society. Speak up and you could be next. The result is a population that learns to stay quiet, to nod along with official narratives, to keep their doubts and concerns private. This is how you manufacture consent, not through persuasion, but through intimidation. The Labour government insists its intentions are pure, that these measures target only genuinely dangerous speech that incites violence or hatred. Ministers point to rising hate crimes and social polarisation as justification for stronger legal tools. On the surface, this sounds reasonable. Nobody wants to see communities torn apart by genuine hatred or violence incited against vulnerable groups. But here's where the argument collapses under scrutiny. The proposed legislation doesn't limit itself to clear incitement or threats. Instead, it introduces concepts like harmful misinformation and divisive rhetoric without properly defining what these terms actually mean. Who decides what counts as harmful? Who determines what's divisive? The answer, inevitably, is government officials, police, and prosecutors, the very people whose policies are being criticised. This creates an obvious conflict of interest where those in power get to decide which criticisms of their power are permissible. The draft bills contain language that would make it an offence to share information about immigration that could undermine public confidence in government policy or create social division. Think about how broad that is. Reporting accurate crime statistics that show disproportionate involvement of recent immigrants could undermine public confidence. Discussing the costs of providing services to asylum seekers could create social division. Questioning whether integration programs are working could fall under either category. These aren't hypothetical concerns. Legal analysts have pointed out that under the proposed framework, much of the legitimate journalism and political commentary that currently exists would become legally questionable. A newspaper editorial arguing for reduced immigration could be investigated. A political candidate campaigning on stricter border controls could face charges. A citizen sharing government statistics on social media could receive a visit from police. This isn't speculation, it's already happening in early forms. Several high-profile cases over the past year have demonstrated how existing laws are already being stretched to silence immigration critics. A councillor in Yorkshire faced investigation for posting about overcrowding in local schools and linking it to immigration. A pensioner in Kent was questioned by police for sharing a news article about migrant crossings. A university professor received threats of disciplinary action for publishing research on integration challenges. None of these individuals were calling for violence. None were using slurs or targeting specific people. They were simply discussing policy issues that millions of Britons care deeply about. Yet the message was clear: talk about immigration in ways that contradict official narratives and you will face consequences. The new legislation would supercharge these capabilities, giving authorities far more power to investigate, charge and convict people for speech that makes government uncomfortable. What's particularly insidious is how these laws will be enforced selectively. History shows that speech restrictions are never applied evenly. They're weapons that get pointed at whoever those in power want to silence. Look at the current landscape of political discourse in Britain. Certain perspectives on immigration are considered acceptable, even praiseworthy. Arguing for open borders, celebrating diversity, calling for more refugees to be admitted. These positions face no legal jeopardy whatsoever. But arguing for the opposite, for reduced immigration, for prioritising integration, for addressing problems created by rapid demographic change, these views are increasingly treated as suspect, potentially dangerous, possibly criminal. The asymmetry is obvious and deliberate. You can advocate for policies that increase immigration without limit, but questioning those policies puts you at risk. This one-sided enforcement transforms hate speech laws from neutral protections against genuine threats into political tools for suppressing dissent. The infrastructure being built to enforce these restrictions is equally concerning. The government is expanding funding for online monitoring units that scan social media for problematic content. Police forces are hiring additional officers specifically to investigate hate crimes and offensive speech. Prosecutors are receiving training on how to build cases around vaguely defined offences, like stirring up hatred or spreading harmful misinformation. Meanwhile, the legal defences available to accused individuals are being narrowed. Traditional protections like context, intent and truthfulness of statements are being diminished in importance. Under some proposed provisions, even factually accurate statements could be criminal if they're deemed likely to stir division, a standard so subjective it essentially gives prosecutors unlimited discretion. The practical effect is that anyone can become a target, and once you're in the system, defending yourself becomes extraordinarily difficult and expensive. The architects of this crackdown are counting on public apathy and division to let these measures pass without serious resistance. They know that many people will dismiss concerns about free speech restrictions with the thought that they have nothing to hide, that these laws won't affect them because they're not racists. This is the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook, convincing decent people that oppressive laws will only target the bad guys, so there's nothing to worry about. But history repeatedly demonstrates that once these powers exist, they inevitably expand. What starts as targeting genuine extremists gradually encompasses political opponents, then critics, then anyone who becomes inconvenient. The definition of what's considered hateful or divisive shifts over time, always in the direction of protecting those in power from accountability. What seems like a reasonable restriction today becomes a tool of oppression tomorrow, and by the time people realise what's happened, it's too late to roll back. Consider how the concept of hate speech itself has evolved over just the past decade. Originally, most people understood it to mean direct incitement to violence or genuine threats against individuals based on their characteristics. Few would object to laws against that, but the definition has been steadily expanded to include offence, discomfort, or questioning of approved narratives. In universities, speakers are now platformed not for advocating violence, but for holding controversial views on gender, immigration, or other sensitive topics. On social media, accounts are suspended not for threats, but for sharing statistics or news articles that contradict progressive orthodoxy. In workplaces, employees are fired not for discriminating, but for expressing traditional viewpoints on family, culture, or national identity. The ratchet only turns one direction, always tightening, never loosening. The immigration speech crackdown represents the next turn of that ratchet, moving from social and economic consequences for wrongthink to actual criminal penalties. The international context makes this even more alarming. Britain isn't acting in isolation. Across the Western world, similar measures are being implemented in a coordinated pattern that suggests ideological synchronisation rather than independent national responses to local problems. The European Union has passed the Digital Services Act, which requires platforms to censor legal speech that's considered harmful misinformation. Ireland has introduced hate speech laws so broad that possessing materials that could stir hatred becomes criminal, even without intent to share them. Scotland passed legislation that makes stirring up hatred an offence, even in private homes. Canada has proposals that would allow courts to place restrictions on people deemed likely to commit hate speech offences in the future, a literal pre-crime framework. Australia is pushing for digital identity verification that would end online anonymity. These aren't coincidental parallel developments. They represent a transnational effort by political and administrative classes to control information and suppress dissent on issues where public opinion has diverged from elite consensus. Immigration is simply the most obvious and urgent flashpoint where this control apparatus is being deployed. Public polling consistently shows that majorities in most Western countries favour reduced immigration and stricter border controls. Yet political establishments continue pursuing policies in the opposite direction, often in direct contradiction to electoral promises. This creates a legitimacy crisis. How do you maintain democratic credibility when you're implementing policies the public doesn't want? The answer, apparently, is to criminalise opposition to those policies. If you can't convince people you're right, silence them. If you can't win the argument, ban the argument. This represents a fundamental betrayal of democratic principles where governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. When that consent is manufactured through censorship and intimidation rather than earned through honest debate and policy success, you no longer have democracy in any meaningful sense. You have what political scientists call soft authoritarianism, where elections still happen and institutions maintain democratic aesthetics, but real power is insulated from popular accountability. The British legal system, once admired worldwide for its protections of individual rights, is being transformed into an instrument of political control. Courts that should serve as checks on government power are instead becoming enforcers of ideological conformity. The independence of the judiciary is compromised when judges must apply laws so vague that their own political views inevitably influence outcomes. When the definition of criminal speech depends entirely on subjective assessments of whether something might cause offence or division, there's no neutral standard to apply. Every decision becomes political. Every verdict reflects not law but ideology. This corruption of legal processes has profound long-term consequences beyond any single issue. Once courts become politicised, once people lose faith that justice is blind and equal before the law, the entire social contract begins to unravel. People stop trusting institutions, they stop cooperating with authorities, they stop believing that peaceful political processes can address their concerns. The result is exactly the social breakdown and division that these laws supposedly aim to prevent.